In this Blender tutorial, I will show you how I made a procedural grunge material in Blender. For ease of using the nodes in the shading workspace, make sure you have the Node Wrangler add-on activated. I add a Musgrave Texture node. This will evaluate a fractal Perlin noise at the input texture coordinates. Then using Ctrl-T, I add a mapping and texture coordinate node. I changed the texture coordinate node from generated to object. This will allow the object to determine how the material will interact with it. I changed the detail of the Musgrave to 16, and I changed the dimension to 0.15. I also changed the lacunarity to 2.2. Next, I add a wave texture. And this will add procedural bands or rings with noise distortion. I changed the type to rings, and I changed the distortion to 5 and the detail to 6. I'll now add a separate XYZ node. And this will allow me to separate the vectors of the object. I connect the object from the texture coordinate node to the vector input of the separate XYZ node. I'll now add a combine XYZ node. And this will allow me to combine the vectors of the object. I connect the X and Z of the separate XYZ node to their corresponding inputs on the combined XYZ node. I then connect the height of the Musgrave texture to the Y of the combined XYZ node. I then connect the combined XYZ vector output to the vector input of the wave texture. I then connect the color output of the wave texture to the base color of the principled shader so I can see what effect the nodes are having on the cube. I'll now group these nodes together using Ctrl-G. Node groups simplify a node tree and allows you to easily add inputs and outputs into the node setup. If I open the Properties panel with N, I can see the node listed under the Items tab. Now I add a color ramp and place it between the wave texture and the group output node. Then I choose the colors I want to use for the gradient. For the black color stop, I'm using the hex code 4C2C18. I add a color stop in the middle. I use the hex code 404921. For the white color stop, I'm using hex code 532211. I then connect the factor of the wave texture node to the bottom input of the group output node. Under the Node tab, I add two inputs. The first one will be for scale, and the second one will be for amount. Now I add two math nodes. These will just simply allow me to use math operations. I connect the scale from the group input node to the top value of each of the math nodes. First math node's value is going to be 2, and the function will be multiply. I then connect it to the scale of the Musgrave texture. The second math node's value remains at 0.5, and the function is changed to multiply. I then connect it to the scale of the wave texture. I then connect the scale of the group input to the detail scale of the wave texture. I now add 2 mix RGB nodes. This will allow me to mix 2 shaders. One is placed between the color ramp and the group output node. And the second one is placed between the factor of the wave texture and the factor of the group output. I then change the connector to the color 2 of the mix RGB nodes. I connect the amount from the group input node to the factor of each of the mix RGB nodes. Now this will control the amount of influence the node has on the output of the texture. Then I make sure that color 1 of each of the mix RGB nodes is pure white. I press Tab to exit the group, and I name the node group. I add a diffuse shader, and this will add diffuse reflections. I also add a glossy shader, which adds a different type of reflection. Then add a mix shader. This is not the same as the mix RGB node. Then I connect the diffuse and the glossy nodes to the mix shader node. This node allows 2 different shaders to be mixed together. I duplicate the mix shader, place it between the principled shader and the material output. I connect the first mix shader to the bottom shader input of the second mix shader. I connect the factor of the grunge node to the factor of the second mix shader, and also to the roughness of the glossy shader. Add a math node, change the factor to multiply. I connect the color of the grunge node to the value of the math node. I then connect the value of the math node to the displacement of the material output. Change the scale of the grunge to 0.2 and the amount to 0.75. Then I apply this same material to the sphere and to Suzanne. Thanks for watching. I hope you found this useful. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and turn on the notifications. Have a good day.